to get started. If you guys can just have a seat. Yes. Go right ahead. And so one of the things that I just wanted to start off saying, first of all, my name is Annabelle Sanchez. I'm a staff attorney here for the RISE Clinic. One of the things that I wanted to talk about is during our initial conversation with the public defenders panel, one of the things that they brought up is that normally they're not thought of as being advocates for victims, right? And they put a lot of thought into naming their panel, which is Defenders at the Table with Victims' Rights. So really, emphasizing that they're also here at the table. And I thought that it was really cool to hear Jimmy's story because Jimmy, his connection to services was through public defender. And I really wanted to emphasize just the closeness and the collaboration that we have, not just with the prosecutors and sometimes not just, discussing these matters with the judge, but then also definitely discussing victim rights with public defenders. And so, we have a mix of people here today from service providers, survivors, and then students. And one of the things that I mentioned earlier today is that it took me about 10 years to be an attorney. And so I hold that responsibility very, very near to my heart. And one of the things that I remember as a student was that I didn't really label myself like I was going to work for one side or the other or just different roles. But what was really important for me was that I was going to work for people, right, and for communities and for a specific movement. And hearing the survivors and hearing the prosecutors and then hearing the public defenders, I think that we all have that commonality, that we're here for a specific movement, not necessarily just within our roles. So with that being said, I'm going to start off over here on my right-hand side to just kind of start off the discussion.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Angela Viramontes. I'm a branch chief with the Federal Public Defender's Office. My office covers San Bernardino and Riverside counties. Before I became a public defender, I had spent 2 years as a rape crisis counselor and medical advocate, accompanying women who had been sexually assaulted to medical screenings and evidence collections. I later represented for 4 years survivors of domestic violence, child abuse, and human trafficking in immigration proceedings. And for the last 13 years, I've been with the Federal Public Defender's Office. And I wear 2 hats in this role. I represent material witnesses. Those are people who have been identified as witnesses to alien smuggling and are very often victims of crime. And then I represent defendants. And one of the reasons I became a public defender, and one of the things that I've seen be true, is about 80 to 90% of my clients are victims of crime. They have suffered child abuse. They have grown up in homes with domestic violence. They have witnessed violence in their neighborhoods. They have been victims of property crimes and crimes of violence in their neighborhoods as well. And what I see with them is these experiences that they've had never get processed. I fully recognize I am not in a position to speak on behalf of victims. But what I can tell you is after years of representing crime victims is that I've heard certain things over and over from many of my clients. And those are the things that I'd like to share with you today. One of the things that I think the criminal justice system could improve on is what we've already heard a lot about today. And that's investing in services for offenders and victims that are accessible. The criminal justice system would help the healing process of victims, the quality of life for victims by having services. And this investment is especially important in areas where there's lack of resources and a concentration of crime and violence. My office, as I said, covers Riverside and San Bernardino counties. And San Bernardino, unfortunately, is often recognized as the second or third most violent city in the state of California. And it also happens to be the largest county geographically. And so if you are a victim of a crime in Barstow and you have to go to the public hospital that is in Rialto, that's going to take you hours. If you need to go to counseling and you live in San Bernardino, you could be looking at taking multiple buses in 110-degree heat. And you need money. You need money for all these very expensive transportation costs. And so I see this as a barrier to helping people and to getting the services that they need. Right now, I practice in the federal judicial system, and the federal system has a lot that it can learn from the state system. All of our resources at this time are directed to helping defendants when they're released on supervision. And the criminal justice system should really be thinking about how to also provide these services to victims. Trauma-informed counseling, mental health treatment, drug treatment, housing, job creation, community service. These services should be given to everyone, just not assisting people with reentry into the community. And one of the reasons I believe these services are so important is because if a victim's needs aren't addressed, what I have seen is it puts a victim at risk for further victimization and may also contribute to some victims committing crimes. The second area I see improvement in is victims should have a say in charging and sentencing decisions. I've heard from victims that they feel a loss of power or control when they become a victim of a crime. And by allowing victims to having a say in charging and sentencing decisions, it helps them feel empowered. And it also strengthens the legitimacy of the criminal justice system. As I'm sure many of you have seen, an offender may very well be a victim's family member or someone who lives in the victim's family community where there's lots of social connections. And in those situations, the victim may not want incarceration, or if they do want incarceration, they don't want a lengthy sentence. And they may really just want rehabilitation, that the person to become better. They may want anger management, mental health treatment, drug treatment, close community supervision. And that perspective should be heard in those two phases. In the federal system, we see a lot of tough on crime sentences, and especially under the last administration. And in the federal system, we have the mandatory minimum sentences where people are looking at 5 years, 7 years, 10-year, 20-year mandatory minimum sentences. And these charging decisions go against the reforms that victims that I have worked with want. They want to see people in treatment programs, job creation in their communities, education, and community health. And in many ways, these hard charging decisions have really hurt the communities where the victims reside. And the last area I think there could be improvement is communication between a victim and an offender. And this is a decision for the victim to make. This shouldn't be something that the defendant initiates. But if the victim wants information, the victim should have a mechanism to do this. Right now in the federal system, there's no real established way to do this, and I believe Mr. Kennedy will speak to this more. But a victim often relies on prosecutor and law enforcement for information about the case. And some victims want information that only a defendant can give them. And they should be able to contact defense counsel so that there's someone there that can give them information on the terms that the victim wants, so the victim is being heard and has information about the proceedings.
Hi, my Prashan Jackson. I'm a Deputy Public Defender for LA County. And the question that was posed was, what could we do to make this a better system? And I kind of ruffle a little feathers because I start off by saying this is a very flawed system. And I keep repeating that because in order to make this a better system, we have to acknowledge that there are flaws in the system. And as my role as a public defender, I don't typically deal with providing services for victims, your traditional victims, what people envision when they hear victims, but I handle a special class of victims, survivors of human trafficking and labor trafficking, and they're often the forgotten victims in the system. You know, studies have shown that between 55 and 98% of the women that are in the penal system in prison have been the victims of rape, sexual assault, domestic violence. So on any given day, they may be a defendant in a case and a victim on another day. And I think we have to acknowledge that because so often what I've seen over my 25 years as a public defender is that when they're in the criminal system, and I won't say criminal justice system because sometimes justice isn't involved when they come, they're just treated as the charge on the piece of paper. There's no examination as to why they got there, what led them to be in that place as a criminal defendant, what trauma they've gone through that has molded their actions and their behaviors. So how do we fix this? I think we first have to start by training. And when I say training, that's all the parties, all the justice partners, as we like to call ourselves, which are the judges, the defense attorneys, the prosecutors, the probation officers, the social workers. They need to be trained on how to deal with this very vulnerable population because they've suffered years and years of trauma. They're not your typical defendant and they're not your typical victim. When I started a program that I'll tell you a little bit about later, I would see these young girls come in and out of court one by one. And over the years, they started to get younger and younger to the point where one particular young lady, I could have sworn she was only about 14 years old. So we did a lot of digging, and it turned out that she was 18, but she had the body and the maturity of a 14-year-old. And no one in that court cared. No one. And I hate to say it, you know, the judge didn't inquire, the prosecutor didn't inquire. And here is this child, basically, with her abuser a few feet away in the audience, directing her on who she can talk to and how she can plead. And it just angered me. It really angered me. So I started trying to give these young women and men services on my own. So I think that we need to do a lot of training so that the bench officers and the public defenders can identify cases like Jimmy. Not 2 years into the case, but when they first come through. Or even the prosecutors, when they're filing these charges, they can look at the rap sheet and see that there are indications that this might be a victim here. Someone who suffered trauma in the past. And you can often see that in some of the past behavior. Now, the services need to be accessible to everyone. And that includes some of the other victims that we've talked about, domestic violence victims, human trafficking victims. If they have to pay for services, it's a waste. They can't afford the $35 or the $45 per session to get the help that they need. It needs to be free, it needs to be accessible, and it needs to be quality-based. And when I say quality-based, we shouldn't just be referring these victims and survivors to some organization on a list. We need to vet those organizations to make sure that they are doing the work that they're saying that they're doing, that they're helping the people that they're saying they're supposed to help. I did drug court for many, many years, and I was frustrated because, unfortunately, sometimes any Jack or Jill can hang up a shingle and say they're running a program, but you don't know if that's a quality program. We need to have collaboration between the public defender's office, the district attorney's office, the law enforcement officers that are out there, or agencies, excuse me. Prior to District Attorney Gascon coming into office, we kind of hit a wall. We didn't have a cooperation. We didn't even have acknowledgement that these people were in fact victims. And the human trafficking court that I'll talk about just very briefly, we started developing that before we even knew who a Gascon was. But we didn't get that buy-in from the former district attorney. We didn't even get a meeting so that we could develop this program. Fortunately, when District Attorney Gascon came into office, he at least gave us a meeting, a seat at the table, and heard about the services, and he acknowledged that this is in fact a very different class of people that need special handling. He acknowledged that they've suffered trauma and that shuffling them off to prison or to jail is not the best or only solution. And he gave us his cooperation so that we could develop this program. And, I hear everybody talk about, let's develop these services. We have to give it more than lip service. And I'm proud to say that it was a public defender, myself and my partner, who went out and developed this program on our own. And the head of our department heard about what we were doing on our private time and said, develop this program out. But it was a judge, Judge David Brown, who actually gave me the idea for it. He saw that I was handling these women and giving them and connecting them to a lot of services, and he said, go out and build this program. So what have we built? We built the first human trafficking diversion court in Los Angeles County. And so we provide individual and group counseling. We provide housing support. We provide substance and mental health services. We provide financial literacy classes because you have to teach these women how to manage money. Many of them don't know the correlation between bad credit and being able to get housing. But more importantly, what we've done is we've developed a career track where we help them develop a career, whether it's LVN, CNA. We have a program with Net Zero, which is an electrical training union school that trains them to be electricians at no cost, starting them off at $23 an hour and providing benefits after 90 days of being on the job. So we are providing real solutions with a way out of the life. And we're training both our public defenders, our bench officers on ways to identify these victims when they first come into court. Because I never, ever hope to hear of another case where a juvenile is locked up for 2 years before someone even takes the time to learn that they're a victim. We should all be angered by that. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lainey Tennant, and I'm an attorney with the Public Defender's Office. And I just want to say thank you, Angela and Prashan. Those were some really great suggestions. Thank you to the district attorneys who spoke earlier. They had some wonderful suggestions. And I also want to say thank you to the survivors that spoke earlier. Your stories were just so insightful and moving, and I appreciate that. From the perspective of a public defender, defense attorney, being invited here with all of you, at first I was looking at the curriculum and I thought, wow, that's an odd request. What could I do to help them? I guess I can just share some things that I've noticed. Busy prosecutors who have a lot of cases many times will forget to excuse their victims when the case is over. I've had to talk to someone and say, hey, your victim's still here. So I think that maybe getting a little more on top of that, which it sounds like thanks to Tiffany and her crew, that they're really trying to get more on top of that. And I think too, it's incumbent on the prosecutor to make sure that the victims in the case that they don't place all their end goal. It seems like they're so invested in the end result of the case. It being like if he gets convicted, then I'm really a victim. And don't make your survival be dependent on the outcome of the case. I mean, get that treatment, get everything beforehand. Give the alleged victims the services before you get to the end. Because if you think that they're going to get convicted and then all of a sudden you're going to be fine, that's not going to happen. Because a lot of times they're not going to get convicted because they're presumed to be innocent, and they're going to have a defense attorney. They're going to have someone that is fighting for them, and that they're going to be poking holes in the case, and maybe there's some other reason that they don't get convicted, or maybe there was a confession that was illegally obtained, or something like that. There are different legal reasons why they won't get convicted. And you can't let your survival be dependent on what happens at the end of the case. So you gotta just get the resources that you need and get that as early as possible. So I think that to the judges, I know that someone else on the panel mentioned that maybe the judges could be more attuned to who's coming to court, maybe to watch the trial, maybe they're the victim's family. I don't agree with that. I don't think that judges should be doing that until there's a conviction, or unless there's a conviction, because I think that if you show deference to witnesses or people who are classified as victims in court, I think that may be inappropriate to do that prior to the outcome of the case. I think that the real person who needs to do that is the prosecutor. So I think that some of the improvements that have been mentioned already by all the panelists are great ideas. One of the things that we're doing, that the Public Defender's Office has been partners, stakeholders with collaborative courts. One of the collaborative courts, so some of the collaborative courts are homeless courts, drug courts. But one of the ideas that I thought of, this happened sort of accidentally, and I had a case where it was just a really run-of-the-mill burglary, where my client was charged with going into a house and stealing some property. The case was set for preliminary hearing, and that's just basically a probable cause hearing where the victim in the case comes into court and you go to another courtroom and you're going to have a very small hearing and determine whether there's probable cause to hold you to answer for the charges. So we go to that other courtroom, and it turns out the district attorney and I discussed a deal, and the client was going to take a deal. So we had everything all ironed out, but the victim in the case was sitting in the back of the courtroom. And so when my client came out to take the deal, my client said, after he pled, he said, who is that person? And I said, well, that's the person who owned the house that you went into. And he said, well, do you think I could talk to him? And I said, well, that depends. What are you going to say to him? And he's like, well, I actually want to tell him I'm sorry. And I said, are you really sorry? And he said, yeah, I really am. And I said, well, you know what? I said, if you want to talk to him, I'll make that happen. So then I talked to the judge, and I said, you know, this may be good. Let's just let him talk to him. And so, sure enough, at the end of the case, my client said and just gave a very heartfelt apology to this victim in court, and said, you know, he basically gave his story that he was on drugs and needed the money, and that he used to be a good person before the drugs and all of this, and he told his story, and the victim was really receptive to him. And the victim actually was saying, you know, I really hope you get better. I hope you get your act together, and get some education, get some drug counseling. And it was a really nice experience. So I would have to say that I think a really good way to improve is to maybe have a restorative justice court, so that in appropriate cases, we could do things like this so that it would benefit the defendant, obviously, and the victim too, I think, because ultimately, most people, at least the thread of what I heard earlier today was that people really wanted to be heard, and that being heard is just so, it's uplifting. And so I think that if I could change one thing, I would have a restorative justice collaborative court, and in the appropriate case, you could have domestic violence, potentially, if your family, if the goal is the family unification, but you could do it in random property crimes. But it would have to be the appropriate case, and it would have to be a situation where, the defendant has admitted guilt and is willing to participate. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sean Kennedy, and I teach here at Loyola and direct the Center for Juvenile Law and Policy, which trains Loyola students to represent at-risk youth in juvenile court. Before that, I was a public defender for 23 years. Most of my work was death penalty. It's very daunting to be here. I really appreciate the invitation from my colleagues at RISE to talk at our Victims' Rights Conference. And I'll just fess up, I have a long and uncomfortable and fearful relationship with survivors in my clients' homicide cases. The last time I interacted with the victim was just a few weeks ago in Long Beach Court, where my client had pleaded guilty to murder, and the victim's brother screamed at myself and my colleague for 10 minutes in court, irate that I was asking for a continuance of a sentencing in a case that I had a 45 days to get ready for trial. And I say that because I feel like, the question is how to get better. I don't exactly know, but I think we do have to get better. I came up doing death penalty cases, both trial and post-conviction, and I was afraid of victims. Whenever I interacted with victims, they were really angry. My client was very uncomfortable in their presence. I did not know what to say to them. What I said in court made them really mad, and I thought I was just doing my job defending my client. A mentor of mine, who I have great respect for, finally brought this up with me when we were representing someone who had driven down from Seattle, Washington in a van full of guns and shot up a Jewish daycare center and hurt a lot of children. And she said, "You need to talk to the victims." And I was like, "Are you crazy? I can't do that." But I learned that I could do that. I went to Eastern Mennonite University, which has an institute that trains defense counsel to work with victim outreach experts, usually from a religious background, who approach survivors and victims on behalf of the defense and simply ask, do you want any information from the defense? Do you want to interact with the defense? Some victims do and some victims don't. But the reason I think it's important for defense counsel to try anyway is because particularly in death penalty cases or homicide cases, in my experience, the survivors have questions that only the defense can provide answers to. The prosecutor's office have victim liaisons, and they do their best to do a great job, but they can't provide certain information that I think a lot of survivors that I have met want to know, which is things like why, how did it go for the person that I love? Did the person say anything? Are you sorry? What's your plan now? And sometimes the defense can engage with those survivors and talk Many times the answer is, we can't answer that question yet, I'm sorry, but maybe later we can, so let's keep talking. And the idea of having defense-initiated victim outreach is a hard sell with many judges. They think that the prosecution already has that service, so why should this be funded? And I understand that, but I think, as is often the case in our adversarial system, when one side has complete control, it doesn't always work out. I know many victims who have waited decades for the execution of my client. I also know many victims who didn't want to participate in a death penalty case and strongly supported a non-capital resolution and wanted that. And I know victims who support my young juvenile clients convicted of homicide getting out on parole and want to be a part of that conversation. And so I think the system really benefits when the option of interaction between the defense and the victims is available. And it remains really scary to me because the religious people, I usually work with the Mennonites who broker conversations, and I lose a lot of control over the narrative because the victim outreach expert makes it clear that they're not here to accomplish my legal goals because, frankly, I do have legal goals. I think having a relationship with the victim often can resolve cases. But the advocate or the outreach expert, they don't view it my way. And so I have to trust them and understand that just listening to what the survivors are interested in talking about and providing truthful information one way or another may help with that. It may not, but it's better than nothing. And so I think one of the best ways to deal with high liability criminal cases, not just little cases, but I mean the really bad cases, is to have more communication between the defense and the survivors, if the survivors want that. But I don't want to be the person who cuts it off because I am afraid to deal with the survivors of violent crime. And I feel like my practice has improved and I've done a better job for my clients, but I also think it is a good thing to be able to give any answers that can be given to the victims and in some way reduce their stress and their pain about the legal proceedings. So that would be my one suggestion.
And so joining us on the panel today, we have Jimmy, who is one of our survivors. We also have Serafin Serrano, who's also one of our survivors. But I'm actually going to start with Serafin and just open up the opportunity if you have any questions or comments for the panelists here.
I'm a big fan of Mike's here. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, first and foremost, I feel like I have to begin with just thanking you for what you do. And I say that having utilized the Public Defender's Office seemingly yesterday as a teenager, shackled up in front of many courtrooms, so I appreciated the representation. So I kind of need to start there. In regards to questions, is what can be done to best understand it? It's kind of already been, I feel, brought up and by numerous people. Have the curiosity to understand the humanity of every individual on both ends. And I've heard the studies, I've read the studies about how many people incarcerated for violent crime specifically have been victims. They're extraordinarily high, and having been incarcerated myself and also having been a child of violence beginning at home, I am rather confident that the numbers still don't reflect the truth, which is, I think of a expression one of my teachers has said, hurt people hurt people. So I feel until we recognize that hurt people are hurting people, we can be a little more strategic, intentional, effective in how we define safety, public safety. So my question is, what on your end can you do that is out of the box, that is new, looking at people's humanity, cases by cases by cases. And I say that sensitive, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, I imagine all the case numbers that you deal with. I'm very cognizant of that. But again, it's all hands on deck, I've been saying for quite some time, so we're all doing our due diligence to ameliorate something that's been going on. And there's been a lot of progress, yet we still have quite some way to go. So again, just what have you all found to be effective and really understanding, right, and then representing your clientele in a just manner, right? Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Anybody that wants to go
Answer
ahead?
that.
Go. Oh, do you want to? So, thank you for that. That's a great question. There's been some recent legislation that just came out in January that requires the court and the prosecutor to consider trauma, consider whether somebody is a domestic violence victim, consider whether someone has mental illness, and to also consider the age of the defendant at the time. So those are all things that we are requiring. So I'm a supervisor in my office, and so I'm requiring that all of our lawyers look into that prior to even thinking about plea bargaining or anything like that. So they are required to delve into that, either through appointing a social worker or a psychologist to go into their previous history.
Is there anything you wanted to add, Ms. Jackson?
Yes, specifically for the human trafficking survivors, we provide the services to help them leave the life. But as a public defender for 25 years, I've also done that with just regular clients. When I have a client, I talk to them and try and figure out where they are and what got them there. And oftentimes I'll try and connect, especially your younger people, to some job opportunities. Because I really believe that when you give people something to lose, they think twice about their actions. I mean, how many times have we been in a situation with maybe a traffic issue and someone cuts you off and you want to react, but then you think about it and you're like, you know what, I have a house, I have kids, let me just let this go and keep on driving. Mm-hmm. When you connect clients with job opportunities and not just flipping burgers or retail, and no offense to that, but ways to make an actual living, a career opportunity, I think that's one of the biggest factors in changing behavior. And I would implore some of the judges here to maybe consider alternative sentencing by sending them to either school or job training programs. Because we've all seen too many times where they come back over and over. But if you give them something to lose, I really think we could see a difference in the system.
Thank you. Jimmy, did you want to comment or ask a question? Oh, I'm sorry, Angela.
Sorry, I was just going to say that our
Go ahead.
office has invested a lot in training. We regularly have trainings throughout the year on how do you discuss issues of trauma with our clients, identifying our clients' needs. And we also have a social services unit now in our office. I think is up to about 5 or 6 social workers, and they are available to help our clients' families, with accessing services that they need to get back on track.
Thank you.
I want to start by thanking from judges to prosecutors for doing the job they're doing right now. And I do believe there is a change. I do believe that we all, from my hope and everyone's hope, there is a change, because by attending these meetings, and actually I do believe what Mrs. Prashan said, that by creating alternative class training from judges all the way to prosecutors and police officers and all departments of law enforcement, I know for sure that there will be a change, and then definitely help develop that communication with survivors and give the needs that this victim needs. Like myself, I needed a housing, I needed food, I need to navigate the legal system here in the U.S. And by not having those kids in my hand, I didn't know where to go. I don't know where I would be right now, or probably dead, deported, or killed. But I mean, you never know. And this situation, I truly believe that this happens everywhere, and it could happen to any one of your family members. It could be behind the street outside, where behind this parking lot. But we should learn how to activate our brain and start working now how to identify those red flags. And I truly believe that by training everyone, we will understand and get to the bottom of this, pandemic, of this issue. And by killing we will never get to the root of it. But by doing the best of ourselves in our positions, wherever you guys are now, I truly believe that we can get the services we need and not get traumatized by looking at you guys in courthouses. I was traumatized by looking at the judges, by looking at their faces. I didn't want to sit to anybody. I didn't want to talk to anybody. I was just scared by the judge calling me an alien. I was like, alien comes from out of the world, from space. That's how it's being placed on residence cards, on the residence card. I'm not an alien. Why we cannot change that word? Instead of being, this person is being illegally, doesn't have a document, why are we being called an alien? And that's another thing that we should work together to understand the situation of another human being by being criminalized and other people taking advantage of their vulnerability of other people. So I truly believe that, and I hope we do our best on what you guys have in your hand. Given the needs, there should be more funding. Like somebody says now only organization, but the Department of Justice should do something about it. Should have more funds to have housing for those people that actually need it. But those people that actually be incarcerated for a reason, for something they did, then, well, they deserve that. But for us, as a victim that we went through a hard time, that we almost lose our lives. And it's not easy to come up here and open up ourselves, talk about what the situation, talk about what we went through. But we're here for a reason. And I believe that myself, my boys, and with you guys here together, we can do something.
I'm now going to open it up to some questions. Judge, did you have any questions?
I do, actually. So, as a judge, I do have a question I actually wanted to pose to this panel. I think, Mary Elaine, you actually touched on it in your answer and gave us your perspective. I'm curious as to whether the other members of the panel share this view or have a different one. And it's this. There have been many good suggestions today talking about how the courts can and should accommodate victims when they come to court. Anything from the simple, like acknowledging the victim's family there, or asking the prosecutor whether the victim rights notification has occurred, to maybe even scheduling hearings such that when victims testify, one can lessen the re-traumatization these are good suggestions that are helpful, right, to a victim. And I know you understand that insofar as you represented clients who have been victims. But putting on your other hat, when you are representing a criminal defendant, these are also accommodations that are helping out essentially an adverse witness, a witness for the prosecution. I'm curious, what's your perspective then on the court providing such accommodation? Is it permissible? Is it us putting our thumb on the scale too much? I'm curious.
I can answer that. I think it's a fine line. I think it's a very fine line. I think as a bench officer, you have to maintain your position of impartiality. And if you do too much to favor any side, that tips the scale of justice. And that's not what we're here for. That's not what the system is supposed to be about. So I think that services for the victims need to start with the prosecutor's office. And of course, the court should be respectful and accommodating to victims, especially children. As a defense attorney, I can tell you there's nothing worse than having to cross-examine a child. As a mother of 3 young girls, I mean, we do our jobs, but even as defense attorneys, I would definitely agree to having them in this safe space to do that type of hearing and not in an open court. But I think when you start acknowledging too much in the courtroom, it gives the impression that the prosecutor's office and the bench are one and the same, and that's what we don't want.
Yeah, I'm really worried about a lot of those accommodations because, the defendant is facing trial and deserves a hearing that is fair and that acknowledges that he is innocent until proven guilty and has full constitutional rights. And so I really would rather have a direct relationship with the victims on my own, not mediated by prosecutors or courts if they want that. I'm not going to push that on them. But it is a real problem. Just the use of the word victim concerns me because it presumes often guilt. And so I find it very difficult to navigate, which is why I said I have a long, uncomfortable, fearful relationship with survivors because I don't want to hurt people who have already been hurt. But I also take my obligation to defend the accused very seriously, particularly when there are very serious consequences. And so, to me, conversations are what I advocate for, where everyone can explain and speak their truth and talk about their challenges.
Okay. Ms. Blackman?
This is a very interesting conversation regarding victims and defense. I can recall probably the worst rape case I've ever represented someone on, and the woman was the same age as me. We lived in the same city. We both had 3 children, and I was very impacted by her testimony. During my cross-examination, she was unraveled. And I was seated next to my client who was also very emotional. And I wanted someone to stop it. And the question became, do I stop it? I looked over and the prosecutor didn't stop it, the judge didn't stop it. I'm like, she needs a break from this. And I remember going home and posting about, as I wanted to do back then, posting about my experience and feeling some shame. Because as a defender, your job is to defend the human being next to you. And I'm expressing incredible empathy, and I thought, what if my client's family saw this? So I deleted it. And there was a piece of me that was very much consumed with the idea that I should have interceded for her. So many, many years later, I was at the supermarket, and I saw her. Yeah, exactly. And she looked at me, and he said, are you a lawyer? And I said, yes, I am. And then she looked back at the fish counter, and I walked over to her and I said, how are you? And she said, I'm better. And then I paused, didn't know what to say. I said, I hope nothing I did in that proceeding made things more difficult for you than they have to be. And she said, you were just doing your job. It has actually absolved me in that moment. And I thought to myself, is it okay, right? As a defender, there's only so much empathy you have. You're filled with like your client's family and the person next to you and all the complexities of that. Do I have enough empathy in my heart to also feel it for that victim? I wonder for you all who've had similar experiences, I'm sure, how do you negotiate that? I still don't know. and I've changed hats a few times, right? I'm now on the side. And so as a DA special advisor, I'm policy, I'm safety, I'm accountability. So I took off my very partial lenses and also expanded my worldview. And it is a different experience altogether. But I wonder for defenders, is there a way for defenders to do their job and protect the rights, constitutional rights of their clients, and also be cognizant to not cause harm?
Yeah, of course. Of course there is. I mean, you can cross-examine a witness without being a juror, and you can get the job done without making somebody feel humiliated for being there. I don't think the two are inconsistent.
You go right to the heart of the matter. I mean, I think most people become public defenders because they want to help people. They're naturally empathetic. But I spent the first 10 years of my career just avoiding victims, because not knowing how to negotiate that. The reason that I think we should do it is, in addition to being a human being in the courtroom, which makes you a good advocate, I just think it's good advocacy to understand that in many of the cases are not going to end well on our side, on the defense side, and that the victims are going to stand up and speak. And wouldn't it be better if we all knew something about each other? They knew that I didn't want to hurt them, that I was just trying to be a good advocate, that I respected them and their opinions even when they want the death penalty. But I just don't think we're very good at it, which is why I think having a defense initiated, like a victim outreach person who isn't burdened with all those obligations to the client, helping build that bridge in a non-manipulative, non-transactional way is a good idea. But courts, resist that a lot, and I don't know why they do, because I think it actually helps facilitate what you do. But the answer is, it's just a terrible problem with violent crime that anyone defending struggles with. And in the end, I think being an empathetic defender for all people, including the victim, makes one a stronger, better advocate. But it's a very fine line. And you cannot abandon your obligation to defend that client, right? And it just feels uncomfortable a lot of the time.
Well, thank you.
So I want to thank everybody today for being on this panel. I'm going to send it back to Stephanie. Do you want a break or?
Yeah, so we'll have our 3-minute break, so let's try to keep up time. And so our last panel focuses on our judge's perspective, and so we can, get out